Hello, all. I thought that rather than responding to your post individually, it might be good to do a quick video that addresses some of your issues, especially since there are some themes that come up across the post, and some of you may not see some of my replies. So I've written down a couple of things that I thought were important for us. One of the things that I saw a lot in your discussion were the issues on how to reconcile the God's violence in the Old Testament with God's violence in the New Testament. I think that was brought up by Melissa and a couple of others. A couple of things that I should think about. It depends what you mean by reconciling. Hopefully, we don't mean I come to these texts and I read about them and they cease to bother me, because I think these stories are disturbing and they kind of represent an extreme response. And so I don't think we should ever get to the place where we can speak about eternal judgment or the destruction of the Canaanites and say, "Oh, I understand this. It doesn't bother me." Now, a couple of things also I might want to say about that as we think through, especially the violence in the Old Testament. One thing that is important to look at is that it's actually inflicted both towards the Israelites and the Canaanites. We think about a lot about the conquest narrative and this God's promise to come in and destroy the Canaanites. We also need to realize that what happens in Israel's history is actually Israel's own judgment in exile. And so it's not the case that God only punishes the Canaanites by judging and exiling them by a foreign nation. It's also the case that God judges and exiles Israel by means of a foreign nation. And so it seems that across the canon, God is consistent in revelation of his character that he judges sin. Now, how do I deal with the issue of violence emotionally and what that reveals about God's character? To me, the answer to that question is most clearly seen in the wider narrative of the Bible itself, and especially in the revelation of God's character on the cross. And what I get when I read the Bible from beginning to end is not the story of a judgmental God whose desire it is to destroy people at a whim. Rather, a God who's gone to great lengths to reconcile people to himself. This is seen in his extensive patience towards Israel when they sin, and God's own patience towards the Canaanites when they sin, which is seen in passages like Abraham in Genesis 15, where God tells Abraham that it's not time for his people to come into Israel precisely because the sins of the Canaanites did not reach their full. Now, that doesn't necessarily deal with the issue of how do I emotionally respond to the issue of violence, but at least puts that violence in a wider context. Another issue that I saw coming up were questions consistently regarding the historicity of certain portions of the Old Testament. Now, to answer that question, we would have to almost go passage by passage and section by section and say, well, is this historical? Is that historical? What do you mean by historical? And those types of things. One of the things that I would say is it's really important to me to I guess there's two approaches to the Bible. One is a hermeneutical trust or hermeneutical suspicion. A hermeneutical suspicion is I come to this text, and unless there's an overwhelming um, amount of evidence, I'm going to disbelieve it. And the other one is the hermeneutical trust to say, if I come to the Bible trusting in its basic truthfulness, do I have enough information to continue in faith? And so I tend to approach the Bible with a hermeneutical trust. And for the most part, where I feel like there's issues of real historicity involved, I tend to come out on the side that I think these things are happening. But it would be hard for me to give that in more than a cursory glance. I would say there are other places that deal more in depth with issues of historicity and the theological implications of it. And I'll see if I can hunt down a couple of books that might get to that issue. Another question that I saw from Christopher is he asked the question as to whether or not, given the violence that we see in the Bible, whether God is in charge or in control. And I think that he contended something like God is in charge but not control, because he thought that control would make God responsible for more evil. I think what Chris was really trying to get at was issues of divine sovereignty and human free will. And the question is whether or not God orders every individual action that a human being engages in, or do people have freedom to make their own decisions? I think it's possible easily to affirm God's sovereignty even in the context of human free will, such that God is sufficiently sovereign to know or to so order history that regardless of human free choices, he's going to bring about his purposes. And so I don't think the issue is in charge or control. I think in any account, a biblical account, God is in a sense in control of history. It's just the nature by which he exercises that control. So, for example, if I tell my son that he can do his homework at 8 o'clock, or he can do his homework as soon as he gets home from school, but my goal is ultimately that that boy does his homework, then I'm still remain in control, even if I'm granting him some freedom within my wider purposes. Let's see, what else that I saw. Once again, there was a lot of talk about the brutality of God in the Old Testament versus the New Testament. And I would say there's kind of two oversimplifications on that. One is that the God of the Old Testament is consistently brutal, which I think a reading of the entirety of the Old Testament probably calls that into question. And the other potential problem is the God of the New Testament is unfailingly gentle. And I would say that Ananias and Sapphira and the Book of Revelation might have something different to say about that. And even Jesus' own um, consistent statements about judgment and damnation. I want to say something, even kind of push it even further about that, because most of us don't really have an issue with the idea of God bringing about justice, right? We all believe that there's certain people who have sinned in such a way that we want God to right those wrongs. You might say something, for example, people who are Nazis, or the people who enslaved African Americans in America a couple of hundred years ago. So the question really isn't whether or not God should judge sin. The question is really who gets to decide what sin God judges, when, and how. And that ultimately gets down to the question of our own idolatry. Are we the one to decide who is and who isn't judged, or is it ultimately God? And one of the ways that I reconcile these issues of violence in both the Old Testament and New Testament is that based upon what I know about the rest of God's character, I trust Him in those places where, as best as I can see, I don't discern His purposes. And so it's not a cop out; it's actually a theological move through these issues. Um, I think those were the main things, and I want to give you a couple of books if if you're really interested in this issue of theodicy, which kind of revealed itself as we move through these historical books. One of them is called "Did God Really Command Genocide?" I think that's the name of it, and I think one of the authors' name is Copan, Coppan, and another one is called "Evil and the Justice of God" by N.T. Wright. Those are two books that at least should give you a chance to think these things through. And what I also want to say around that issue is that we should never have it as our goal to understand so as to be comfortable. I think that we should have as our goal, especially when it comes to these difficult texts, is to say, can I still believe in the God revealed in these texts? And can I still believe in the God who or can I believe in these texts themselves? So I hope that was helpful. I hope this is a better way for me to communicate with you all. I'm really enjoying your comments, your responses, and your thoughtful interactions with the text. I want to encourage you, especially as you read through these historical books, and in every place, to be sophisticated in your reading of Scripture. What I mean by that is that make sure you consistently draw the distinction between the events that the Bible describes and the events to which the Bible lauds. Especially when you're in places like the book of Judges, there are tons of things in the book that I'm sure God and we find reprehensible, and they're not in the Bible because they're laudatory. They're in the Bible precisely because these are the things that happen, which actually lead me away from some of these accounts of fiction. Because if I was writing propaganda for my people, I might have made it a little bit more glorious than the robust account of sin that we find up and down the Old Testament. All right, thanks a lot. I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.